Hello and welcome to another episode of Thoughts Per Chapter, Birth of a Killer Edition. Last chapter, Larten was fleeing for his life throughout the city which was hunting him for his killing of Traz, the lovely foreman. In this chapter, Larten is seeking shelter from the storm and the rain. We don't know if it's an actual storm, but let's call it a storm. He's looking for shelter in a crypt. I wonder if he will meet anyone there. The chapter opens with a line: "The graveyard was larger than Larten had imagined, and while it was no match for the lavish city of dead to the north, there were a few crypts jutting out of a crop of crosses and tombs." I have questions about that. I assume he just means there's a larger graveyard ahead, but maybe he means the actual city from which Larten has just fled is the City of the Dead. Darren Shan does have a book called City of the Dead. I've actually never read those books. That could be fun to do as part of his series. I wonder if it's a reference, or I wonder if it's just coincidental wording. We're treated to an image of Larten scrambling across the graves, muttering prayers to every god he'd ever heard of, eyes cast low. And that really paints Larten as like this spider. I don't know why, but that gives me an image of a spider. He believes in ghosts, witches, and demons, so I guess it shouldn't be that far out that he meets a vampire in this chapter, right? This scene also reminds me of Darren the character picking his way through the sleeping bags at the Cirque du Freak trying to get to Madame Octa. We get this traditional horror thing of Larten thinking he hears a sound behind him, but when he turns around there's nothing there. This could be Sibanile. This could be Sibanile watching him, or it could just be Larten being jumpy. I mean, he does then immediately make his way toward the crypt where Sibanile would be hiding, but then Sibanile is a lot faster than your standard human boy. The crypt door sliding open smoothly is a fun kind of turning on the head of expectation there. That's called subversion of expectation, Christian. Use your words. Because you would expect a crypt door to open like, But obviously because Sibanile has come along with his can of WD-40 and oiled it up so that he can get ease of entrance to his hotel for the night, it's already had that done to it. Larten thinks it could be because someone inside was pulling the door as he was trying to push it open, and it could be Sibanile again being a prankster, but I don't think he would. I think it's supposed to evoke this idea of fate tempting him in, come on in, the water's fine. Also, this is the first time we have an inner voice speaking. "Are you mad?" A voice very much like Ver's whispered inside his head. "Don't go in there. It's a place for the dead." And that's interesting on a few different levels. Across pretty much every Darren Shan book I've ever read, there has been this inner monologue, and he does some really interesting things with it in the Demon Artist series that I would love to talk about, but we're not got there yet. We've got full Vampire Saga spoilers on the screen here, not full Demon Artist spoilers, so I will keep my trap shut. But also I love that the voice is very much like Ver Horsten's, because in vampire lore in this series, when someone is dying, sometimes it is a very kind thing to do at their request to fully drink their blood to absorb part of their soul, as we see in the main series. So I like this idea that some part of Verhorsten's soul has attached itself to Larten's, not in a literal sense, but in a metaphorical sense here. And finally, "Are you mad? It's a place for the dead." Yeah, Larten's life is pretty much over at this point, so you might as well keep going. It also shows Larten's courage, because he is terrified. He believes in ghosts and werewolves and zombies, and depending on which Darren Shan book you're reading, some of those may or may not be true. So it's good that he's got that courage. He's gonna need some of it moving forwards. You can see why Sibanile would be curious about this youngster. I love a passage: "There were glass panels in the ceiling. That seemed strange to Larten, but maybe some of the people buried here had been afraid of the dark." That's a very childish thought to have. It's reminding us how innocent and youthful Larten is. And it could also, by the other side of a coin, be talking about how foolish the whole idea of having a crypt even is for a wealthy dead person. Maybe that is the actual reason why there are glass windows, Listen to this scenery. "He remained by the door while his eyes adjusted, then studied the crypt. There were brick walls on either side behind which the coffins were stacked. A strange sort of ornamental fountain was in the middle, no sign of any ghosts." I don't remember the fountain. When I think of a scene, I normally think of it as a coffin in the middle of a room, and it's like a small crypt with not a lot of coffins around. But that's a really nice image. I don't know if I forgot about the fountain. I have a feeling it comes into play later with Siba taking a drink from it, maybe. Or if sometimes I do this thing where I'm so invested in the story, the plot being told and the characters telling it, that I tend to skip over some of the expositionary detail of the setting, so it's nice to be reading this with more of a fine-tooth comb this time. I don't like literally skip sentences, by the way, but they just don't make an impression on me like that, if you know what I mean. I like the fountain as well, because it's like the fountain of life, but it's like the fountain of unlife. Lartin wants to take off his clothes to let them dry, but then he doesn't want to have to flee naked through a graveyard in case there's any creepy crawlies chasing him. And it's lucky for us that Lartin is superstitious, or he might have met Siba Nile naked. Although that's some imagery in itself, actually, now that I think about it. I don't think Siba Nile would be like, ew, gross, and like run away or whatever. He would just be like, oh, what's a small terrified naked child doing here? A few chapters ago I talked about like how in my head I was like directing one of the scenes. I'm doing it again here. Like all of this imagery we get of Lartin walking through the crypt, I feel like would be shown from like high up angles, or like the corners of rooms, or like behind coffins and stuff. Like I get the impression that Siba Nile is watching all of this. Lartin rues that the owners didn't visit the factory before lunch. Quote, trust Traz to pick the worst possible time to get killed. Lartin chuckled again. He knew murder was wrong, and he wished he could go back and change this day. But in all honesty, he wasn't sad that Traz was dead. So, Lartin, not remorseful. Not about the actual act of killing, anyway. In this world where life is valued so cheaply, can you really blame him, though, for not stopping and feeling monumental guilt for taking a life? He's been taught that life is not worth much. Okay, so the fountain is covered in cobwebs. Got it. That's what I'm semi-remembering here. Quote, he ran a couple of fingers through one of the webs, breaking the strands. Then he twirled his fingers around several times, adding to the webby covering. When it was thick enough to hide his flesh, he brought his fingers to his mouth, shut his eyes, and peeled off the webs with his teeth. Lartin almost vomits, but forces himself to eat them. Quote, then, out of the solemn, sinister silence of the crypt, as he was sucking more of a spider's silk from his sticky fingers, someone spoke from a spot high above and behind him. Are cobwebs a treat where you come from? That was one sibilant paragraph. Sibilant? I can never remember. So yeah, I absolutely adore this idea of, like, first of all, just full-on gothic, like, like a lone kid starving, running from a mob, goes into a crypt and eats cobwebs to try and fill his rumbling stomach. Delightful stuff. But also that later on in Lartin's adult life, when he joins the Cirque du Freak, he has this part of his act where he eats Madame Octa's spiderwebs and says, those are a treat where I come from, or something like that. It's one of the first things we ever hear him say, and it's just so wonderful the way that this wraps back into the very beginning of his story, and the fact that he's like privately like referencing Siba Nile to himself when he does it. It draws a parallel as well, again, between Lartin's origins and Darren the character's origins. There are a lot of things from Lartin's comments and descriptions in the original series that are, I won't say retconned, but like retroactively added to his backstory in the prequel series. And I can't say it's retconned because that might have been a plan from the start, but a lot of the time it is done, as I said in a previous episode, with tremendous grace, and this is one of those times. There are a few times when it feels slightly clunky, I'll point those times out to you, but most of the time it's great, and I think this is one of the best times of that. Sorry, I just ran out of vocabulary, I think. Also, yeah, this whole chapter up to A Cobweb's a Treat Where You Come From, that was like the teaser we were given when Darren, the author, was telling us that he was starting a Lartin Crepsey series in his book signing event all those years ago. That sentence being used to reveal what the book was about. I believe every time the name Lartin was mentioned, I believe it was something like the red-headed child instead, to give us kind of like a hint as to what was going on, but not immediately spoil the reveal. So that was pretty cool. We get this terrifying description of Siba Nile. He is a red-skinned beast with a pale face and long dark hair streaked with white. Its claws were dug into the bricks, and it was studying Lartin with what seemed to be a wicked, bloodthirsty smile. That's a very different first impression to when we first meet Siba Nile in Vampire Mountain, and he's this kindly old quartermaster. I would ask you to stay a while, the creature murmured, and something in its tone made Lartin pause. There's this great image of Siba Nile looking down upon Lartin from the doorway, almost Spider-Man Mary Janing it, you know. Siba seems very much like a spider in this instant too. Lartin recognizes the loneliness in the creature's voice though, and that stops him from running for his life. What are you? Lartin gasped. Should not the question be, who am I? The creature asked, then released its grip, dropped to the floor and stood. I like the detail that Larton thought that Seabanile had red skin, but it was his clothes. They must be some dusty-ass clothes to blend in with skin. Although I guess when you're in that much of a panic, you're probably not going to take all the visuals in properly. But later on down the road, we get this whole thing where Larton tries to style himself to be like Seabanile. He tries to talk like him, he tries to dress like him, and I like to imagine that Larton never quite forgot the first impression that Seabanile gave him of this like terrifying red-skinned monster, and he's like, I want to be feared. I do find it maybe slightly suspicious that Larton would trust Seabanile as he is in the middle of trying to run away from everyone and running for his life, but maybe Seabanile is different enough. Maybe Larton sees enough of himself in Seba to give him the benefit of the doubt. I bid you welcome, Larton, Seba said warmly, and without releasing the boy's hand, he led him back into the shadows of the crypt. The crypt being a place of death, and the vampire being a being of death. A vampire is technically undead in the Darren Shan vampire universe. That is something I would like to know. Does their heart stop? I can't remember if it's mentioned. Or are they just altered? Are they just mutants? I know they share a lot of their DNA with wolves, so maybe in a weird way they're werewolves. Anyway, I'm reading too much into this. That was Chapter 6 of Birth of a Killer. We're getting to the vampire stuff. How exciting is that? If you have a thought about this chapter, please feel free to leave a comment down below about it. Please, if you liked the video, remember to give it a like. That helps the channel very much. Subscribe for more every day, hopefully, and I will see you in the next video. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Thoughts Per Chapter. Blood? What even starts with blood that I'm doing right now? Damn it. One day I'll get this right first time. The chapter opens with a line, the graveyard was larger than Larton had expected. Oh, fuck.